He says categorically, I drove the man who did kill Tucker, Tate and Rolfe to Rettendon, and that man is the man who was responsible for murdering them.
No one expected much the day that William George Jasper took the stand. A shaven head, squared-shouldered bruiser of an East End hardman. He spoke mostly in sentences of 5 words or less, in a sullen, monotone voice. But as his incredible story unfolded, the entire courtroom ended up hanging on his every syllable. Jasper had been arrested on theft and drug charges on the 16th of January 1996, a little more than a month after the murders. During his initial interviews at Rayleigh Police Station, he said little. But after a few hours, he began to relate the tale of the 5 large ones he'd earned for a bit of driving he'd done the months before. The saga began in a Mexican restaurant in Canning Town in the middle of December. Jasper, along with 2 leading members of an East End crime syndicate, were discussing what to do about a gang from Essex who had arranged to purchase some cocaine. The word on the street was that the Essex boys were not planning to hand over any cash, but instead had bought a machine gun and were going to rip off the London team. The Essex firm in question was of course none other than Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. The East End gang was ran by Jesse Gale and a man known only as Mr. D. For Gale, the discussion had a personal element. He'd been ripped off by Tucker before, to the tune of £20,000, and there was no way he was going to let it happen again. As the beers flowed and the enchiladas went down, so the conversation got more serious. "Why don't we rob 'em?" said Gale. Mr. D shook his head. "We can't do that. There'll be too many comebacks. We're better off taking them out of the game, putting them out of misery." Now it was Gale's turn to shake his head. "Nah, just rob 'em," he said. Mr. D then turned to Jasper and asked him if he wanted to earn £5,000 for a night's driving. On the evening of the 6th of December, 1995, the night of the murders, Jasper picked up a grey Fiat Uno Turbo from outside the Peacock Gym in East London. He drove to a bar near Hornchurch, where he picked up Mr. D, who was carrying a sports bag. Jasper soon learned the bag contained a sawn-off shotgun and a 9mm Browning pistol. From there, the pair travelled to a cab office, where they found Jesse Gale waiting outside. Jasper waited in the car while Mr. D got out, taking the bag with him, and disappeared with Gale down an alleyway. 10 minutes or so later, Mr. D returned and told Jasper to drive him to Rettendon. Pulling up alongside a lane close to a garden centre, Mr. D got out, again with the bag, and told Jasper he was going to pick up 4 kilos of cocaine. He returned around 40 minutes later carrying the sports bag, and also a foot-square rucksack. As the pair drove back to London, Mr. D called Jesse Gale and told him everything was sorted. It was only when he saw the news of the murders the following day that he realised what had happened. He had already arranged to meet Jesse Gale the following evening at Morton's bar in order to pick up his fee, and he turned up just before 10 p.m. I thought they were going to just do a deal, but somewhere along the line they changed their mind. When I got to Morton's bar the next night, Gale was already there. He asked me what I wanted to drink. I said Jack Daniels and Coke, and he got me a large one. I had a couple of mouthfuls, and then he said he was going to the toilet, and for me to wait a couple of minutes and then follow him. I found him in a cubicle, cutting up some cocaine. I had a couple of snorts, then he gave me the money. I said something like, "You cunt, you fucking took them out of the game." He gave me a little grin, a smirk, and said, "Don't ask questions. What are you, a cozzer?" And that was me intro to shut up. Jasper's testimony seemed to be the final piece in the jigsaw as far as the defence were concerned. They had solely proved beyond doubt that Darren Nichols was a liar. He had admitted as much himself. Yet Steele and Williams had solid alibis from where they were, and what they were doing the night that Tate, Tucker and Rolfe had died, and that they'd provided a highly convincing alternative explanation at how the men had met their death. In the public gallery, relatives of the family of Jack Williams were starting to feel confident that things would go their way, while the relatives of the dead men were starting to shuffle around uneasily. "The whole case has been unnerving for all the family," said Marie Tate. But Billy Jasper's evidence was the most unnerving of all. They were not the only ones suffering. In September 1996, 5 months after their arrest, and exactly a year before the trial had begun, Michael Steele and Jack Williams had appeared at Belmarsh Magistrates Court. After a week of evidence, the trial was passed on to the Crown Court, and the trio were told they had 7 days to file notice of alibi. If they had witnesses or evidence that proved they could not be responsible for the murder, they had only a week to submit it. The rule is a simple extension of the caution given to anyone who is arrested, that while they have the right to remain silent, if they later in court rely on something they have not previously mentioned, the jury can be made aware of this. In other words, if rather than explaining their actions or whereabouts straight away, they appear to have gone away and had a good think about it, about the best possible excuse, then the jury has a right to know. For Steele and Williams, their alibis had seemed straightforward enough, if slightly weakened by the fact that their only witnesses were relatives. What weakened them far more was the revelation that the pair had not submitted their alibis until July 1997, more than 10 months late and just 8 weeks before the start of the trial. Not only that, Steele's shockproof, rockproof alibi quickly began to crumble. The till receipt didn't necessarily relate to the credit card slip. Anyone could have bought the petrol at that garage at 5 p.m. It also transpired that Steele's former sister-in-law, Phyllis Stanbrook, whose evidence that he'd been home around the supposed time of the murders, did so much to support his version of events, had not been asked to give evidence or make a statement until a few months before the trial. She was clearly critical, so why wasn't she contacted sooner? That question was intriguing enough on its own, but when Andrew Monday QC began to question her about how she could be so sure of the date she and her daughter visited Steele's house, her answer surprised everyone. "That's the day the solicitor told me it was," she admitted. "Let's say he spoke to you on March the 1st, said Monday. "If I'd asked you on February the 28th, or what date you went round to see Mr. Steele, what would you have said?" Miss Stanbrook paused for a moment, then replied, "I would have said I can't recall." When it came to Jack Williams, his recollection of shouting through the letterbox of his uncle's home seemed equally flawed. While in the witness box, he repeatedly told in great detail how he bent down, held the slot open with his hands, and shouted through the door. Andrew Monday then showed Williams and the jury pictures of the door in question. It had no letterbox. As for the supposedly broken down Passat that Williams had picked up for Darren Nichols, the court heard from a local car breaker who gave a very different version of events. The day after the murder, Williams had driven the vehicle to the man's scrapyard and told him, "Do what you like with it, just as long as there's nothing left that can come back to me." Rather than destroying it, the man checked the vehicle out and found that it still had some life in it. He sold it on. Then there was the evidence of Billy Jasper. Soon after his arrest, police in Chelmsford had contacted Ivan Dibley with the news that a man in custody was confessing an involvement with the triple murder. By mid-July, Dibley and his team had already gathered a wealth of evidence against Michael Steele that pointed to him being the killer. Jasper's story was intriguing, but failed to fit in with much of the evidence gathered thus far. A quick check into Jasper's background provided an answer. He had a history of confessing to crimes that he had nothing to do with. A self-confessed drug addict who admitted that he spent £400 a day on heroin and crack cocaine. He clearly found it difficult to distinguish between fantasy and reality. "He was such a Walter Mitty, we just couldn't take anything he said seriously," said Ivan Dibley. "We looked into his claims, but there wasn't much substance. We told Chelmsford police to continue the investigation and to let us know if anything came of it. Nothing ever did. That only left the mystery of why, if Jasper was lying, the members of the East End gang he had fingered for the crime had done nothing to shut him up. Although he had named them during his original police interviews, Jasper refused to name anyone in court, claiming he was too scared of reprisals. But even when the names eventually came out in the open, Jesse Gale, who later died in a car crash in May 1998, and Mr. D did not seem overly worried about being linked to the crime. In fact, dozens of villains all across the country were happy for people to think they might have been involved. In a world where double crosses and rip-offs are becoming increasingly common, the kudos of having wiped out 3 of the country's most dangerous men and having got away with it is undoubtedly the best protection of all. Just after midday, on Thursday the 15th of January, the jury of 8 women and 4 men retired to consider its verdict. As Steele and Williams waited anxiously in their cells below, the news came just before 4 p.m. that they had failed to reach a verdict. The jury was sent to a hotel and told to return to court the next day. The next day it happened again, and the jury were told to return to court on Saturday to see if they could reach a verdict. By the middle of Saturday afternoon, it was clear they would not, and their stay at the hotel was extended yet again. Mr. Justice Hidden decided to give them the Sunday off, hoping to give the jury the chance to relax by taking them all out on an organised trip. They returned on Monday happy, but still unable to agree, and stayed at the hotel yet again. In any criminal case, reading a jury is almost impossible. Some say the longer the deliberations go on, the more likely the verdict will be not guilty. Others say extended deliberations show that not all members of the jury are in agreement and are attempting to convince one another of their version of the truth. But often, as the case with the Rettendon trial, it is simply that the jury are going over every item of evidence before taking their vote. They ask for additional material, to see certain pictures, to read transcripts of certain interviews once more. On Tuesday, 20th of January 1998, after 5 full days of deliberation, the jury returned its unanimous verdict: guilty. Back in the court, Worms and Steele glanced at each other for a moment, then both shrugged their shoulders, then looked back to the judge. "There is no other sentence I can pass on you for those horrifying murders of which you have been convicted than that of life imprisonment," Justice Hidden told the pair. "There is little that can be said usefully about either of you at this stage. You two were responsible, in my view, for taking away the lives of these 3 victims in a summary way. You lured them to a quiet farm track and executed them. They had crossed your path and you showed them no mercy. There is about these killings a hard and ruthless edge, which can only horrify and stagger the non-criminal mind. You are extremely dangerous men, and you have not the slightest compunction for resorting to extreme violence when you thought it was necessary. Both men were told they would serve a minimum of 15 years. It took a while for the shock to settle in, but as the pair travelled back to Belmarsh, Steele tried to look on the bright side. "Don't worry, Jack. I'll make sure wherever we end up, we do the time together. At least we'll have that." Worms turned to face Steele, holding his stare for a second or two before he spoke. "Fuck off. I never want to see you again."